was a graduate of, correct me if I get this wrong, Ctbuh University in Istanbul and the University of Tokyo, and is currently a PhD student at the University of Tokyo. She is also currently working part-time with Arrow in Japan.
Good morning. This is Hande Ünlü. This is Hande Ünlü from the University of Tokyo. Today I'm going to talk about our research, which is titled Oppressive Impact of High-Rise Office Buildings on Inhabitants through an Istanbul Case Study. First of all, I'd like to introduce you to the main concept and aim of this research very briefly. In the last century, through socio-economical evolutionary turbulence of globalization, particularly big metropolitan areas were evolved into high-rise built environment from their local patterns. This urban transformation all over the world is an eventual outcome of these keywords that are shown in this slide, which triggered and empowered each other in time. Many skyscrapers were built and has been built with an appropriate consideration of sustainability or not. The aim of this research was to point out the social and physical impacts of high-rise, particularly the office buildings, on the inhabitants, and to identify the inhabitants' ideal image of a high-rise office building. The hypothesis was, if inhabitants can find more opportunities to interact with their globalizing closed environment, their attachment feeling towards this environment will relatively increase, which means local meets global and generates a harmonious glocal. Hence, a redefinition of interaction was required. In this research, high-rise office buildings were considered not as a unit-scale building, but due to the intense context and the mass of high-rise office buildings, they were studied as a vertical urban space. Following this main approach, the 5 urban design elements from Kevin Lynn's work, The Image of the City, were considered as the interaction-generating design elements in between of a high-rise office building and inhabitants. Next, the Lynch's 5 elements, here you see landmark, district, edge, path, and node elements, were redefined and adapted into vertical urban space of a high-rise office building. Here you see each design elements and the activities they generate in a high-rise office building concept on the left. Based upon the redefinition of Lynch's 5 elements and each one's level of quality, this research classifies the high-rise office buildings into 3 types. In hypothetical definitions, type 3 is claimed to be the most efficient interaction-generating and attractive type high-rise office building for inhabitants. The hypothesis was investigated through an Istanbul case study by a questionnaire type survey in May 2007. Istanbul has been a capital for almost 16 centuries, from the foundation of Constantinople in the 4th century AD to the end of the Ottoman Empire in the 1920s. Since the establishment of the Turkish Republic in 1923, Istanbul, currently with a population of over 15 million people, has kept its prominence as the biggest city in the Republic and as one of the biggest cities in the Middle East. In this study, Istanbul was selected as a case study area of secondarily globalizing city. Istanbul, with such a long history and strong local patterns today, is also gaining more importance in the global market. Through its national heritage areas, high-rise office buildings are now occupying the background image and day by day coming in front. The questionnaire survey, which consisted of 2 sections, was given to 300 Istanbul inhabitants. The aim of section 1 was to obtain general information about respondents' preferences between local and global patterns of Istanbul and to identify the Istanbul inhabitants' demographic profile. At section 1, inhabitants' general response to their globalizing environment was obtained over 3 scales, which were uniqueness, cultural representation, and economic gainings. In the survey, 3 scales were rated through the comparison of local patterns, which were labeled as A, B, C, against the global patterns, which were labeled as D, E, and F. Here in this graph, you can see the results of Istanbul inhabitants' responses to the local patterns against the global ones over 3 scales. Briefly, 80% of Istanbul inhabitants rated local patterns as more impressive than global patterns for each scale. Therefore, 40 years and older age, high income, long-term residents were the inhabitants who were the most unliking the image of their globalizing environment. Last 3 questions of the section 1 was about the inhabitants' response towards the city's high-rise office building density, satisfaction to this density, and the tendency towards the idea of living in a vertical city. According to the results, Istanbul inhabitants thought the high-rise office building density in the city is moderately high, and they were slightly satisfied with the situation. Therefore, Istanbul inhabitants were not yet much attracted by the idea of living in a vertical city. According to the comparative investigation on the age profile of the respondents, 40 years and older inhabitants were the least satisfied of high-rise office building density, while the young respondents were the most satisfied. Also, young inhabitants were more tended to the idea of living in a vertical city. According to the income profile of the respondents, Istanbul inhabitants with low income were more attracted by their globalizing environment and liking the idea of living in a vertical city, although they could never afford. As for the accommodation profile of the inhabitants, the central business district closed area inhabitants were more satisfied with the density of high-rise office buildings in the city and more attracted by the idea of living in a vertical city. One of the most important central business districts in Istanbul is called Levent, which is located in the European side of Istanbul. Levent has also a significant importance due to its location in Istanbul. It has good access to the bridges, which connect the European side to the Asian side and also to the other important business districts of the city. However, through this area, the poorest and the richest areas of Istanbul are separated from each other by Büyükdere Road, where the most high-rise office buildings are located beside. Gültepe area is the poorest area in this district, and interestingly, according to the results, its inhabitants were the most attracted group of inhabitants by the idea of living in a vertical city. Contradictorily, in the neighborhood, the Levent area's inhabitants, who have the highest income, were the most opposed group to the idea of living in a vertical city. As a brief summary of Section 1, local patterns and the cultural boundness are significantly important in the response of Istanbul citizens. High-rise office building closed area inhabitants who were between 18 to 24 years old, grown up in between these buildings with the lowest income, were the most tended group of inhabitants to live in high-rises. The observations led us questioning whether if this outcome is a social polarization that was caused by the capitalist globalization era. Section 2. In Section 2, aim was to identify the image of an ideal high-rise office building in Istanbul through the inhabitants' satisfied conditions and expectations. And Section 2 consisted of 17 rating scales, which were decided to be important factors in design of a high-rise office building. These factors were either representing the Lynch's 5 elements or global image indicators. The mentioned global image of a high-rise office building in this research means the internationalized social and physical concept of the building. In Section 2, initially, respondents rated their satisfaction of each scales for the given subject, high-rise office buildings, in this research. Then they rated the same scales based upon each one's importance in design of a high-rise office building. Type 1 subject high-rise office building was Ctbuh Tower in this research, and respondents rated their satisfaction over 17 scales for this building. Briefly, Ctbuh Tower is a 25 stories office building and social facility spaces are not open for the public use. Type 2 subject high-rise office building was Inhabitants Towers, which is a 53 stories high business and art complex. It's partially open to the public use with its cultural activity and dining and shopping areas. Moreover, Inhabitants Towers complex site is prominently an isolated area from its neighborhood. Type 3 subject high-rise office building was Canyon, which is a newly built large complex, consists of a business tower, residential towers, theater halls, and a large shopping mall. Canyon has a transitive interaction generating social spaces open to the public. Here you see the location of each buildings of Istanbul survey. Initially, in section 2, the respondents were asked whether if they had been to any of these buildings, and the reason of the visit were also asked. The most frequent reasons of visit was shopping, and the most visited type was type 3. Okay? When the design scales were grouped into Lynch's 5 elements and global image indicators categories, the closest type to the inhabitants' ideal image of a high-rise office building was obtained to be type 3, which approves the hypothesis. Moreover, among Lynch's 5 elements, the most important one was rated also as the landmark element. According to the factor analysis, 17 scales were grouped into 6. These are group of landmark, age, path and node, district, social harmony, and social status. For Istanbul inhabitants, the most important factor of a high-rise office building was its modern design. To check the validity of hypothetical definitions, the social and physical interaction generating elements were evaluated for each high-rise office building type. In the table, the optimal value represents the average satisfaction rate, which was obtained from the ratings of respondents only who evaluated the importance of each scale equal or more than magnitude 3/5. Survey result value represents the average satisfaction rate, which was obtained from the overall responses. And therefore, the hypothetical definition for type 3 could again be affirmed as being the efficient interaction generating type high-rise office building. The global image of a high-rise office building in Istanbul was found to be correlated with the proper orientation of Lynch's 5 elements. Here is the case-sensitive design configuration for Istanbul. Conclusions. Cultural representation and interaction quality of the buildings were found to be one of the most important factors in design of a high-rise office building. The hypothetical redefinitions and adaptation of Lynch's 5 urban design elements to the high-rise office building concept as being the generators of interaction were confirmed to be valid. According to the hypothetical high-rise office building categorization, the efficient interaction generating type was at the same time observed to be the most satisfying and attracting type high-rise office building. In order to keep the necessary cultural representation quality of the building, the necessary amount of global image quality was formulated based on the Lynch's 5 urban design elements. Case-sensitive formulation can hypothetically be valid for the global cities that are in the same level of Istanbul. The proposed design criteria in this research were based on the inhabitants' own expectations in order to set a local architecture, which is obtained by global plus local architecture. Therefore, this research was followed by a second case survey in Tokyo in November 2007 and comparatively investigated with Istanbul case results. Therefore, this research can be followed by further case surveys in other global cities from different levels, and more identical local architecture criteria can be formed. Thank you.